Next up in the VMware Explore Hub Theater, please welcome the marketing lead for Backstage at Spotify, Jeny Kelly.
Hi, everybody. Oh, my goodness. This is awesome. Hi, I'm Jeny Kelly. I lead marketing for Backstage at Spotify. And I'm here today to do basically what my job is, which is talk to people about why Backstage, or why Spotify built Backstage internally, what we've learned in open sourcing it for the past 2.5 years, and why we believe it is and is going to be a very big part of this growing trend towards better developer experience, or as we've coined it, happy developers make happy code. So first off, what is Backstage? Well, I can really answer that question in 2 ways. And one, Backstage is the UI and interface that Spotify developers work with every single day to get their work done. And secondly, Spotify is an open source platform for building developer portals. It was created at Spotify, open sourced in March 2020, and since we open sourced it, it is now an incubating project at the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, which is home to some open source projects you might have heard of, like Kubernetes, Envoy. Ringing any bells? So first off, why Backstage? Well, in order to answer that question, I want to talk a little bit about the market context we live in. I can't remember which VC said this, but software is eating the world, and I'm here to say that software is still eating the world. Developers have access to more technology than ever before, and that comes with more responsibilities than ever before. On any given day, an engineer at your company is interacting with systems for alerting, monitoring, security, compliance, data pipeline and ML pipelines, documentation, Kubernetes, cloud provider consoles, services and libraries owned by other teams. The list goes on and on. So every one of these tools comes with its own interface, its own way of doing things, and navigating between these tools is what creates a lot of complexity. It requires engineers spending much less time actually writing code, more time trying to find stuff, more time trying to tap people on the shoulder. So it makes onboarding and collaboration, and it creates a lot more difficult and creates a lot of internal fragmentation. Here we go. So what is a developer portal? It's an old name that may harken back and give everybody the scaries, but it's a new category. And essentially what it means is one front end for your entire infrastructure. So what a developer portal does is unifies all your tooling, services, apps, data, and docs within a single consistent UI, regardless of how and where the individual components are running. And ideally, it allows developers to do what they do best, which we hope leads to much less activity in your #arg Slack channel. So if we take a trip back to 2016, Spotify was in hyper-growth mode. We were expanding our mission from a music streaming service to a personalized audio experience platform. And we were hiring engineers at a breakneck pace, but that wasn't actually leading to our developer productivity metrics getting better, despite all the new hires. So we were actually experiencing even like our North Star onboarding metric of time to 10th pull request getting to upwards of 60 days. So a new hire wasn't able to meaningfully contribute to their teams until 2 months into their tenure. So what we were trying to solve was not a unique problem. Every development shop wants roughly the same 3 things: speed without compromising safety, scale without compromising quality, and the ability to tame ever-growing chaotic ecosystems of software. Spotify was absolutely no different. So we took the humans-first product development lens that we would take to any consumer product at Spotify, and we conducted user research, and we asked our engineers what was blocking them. And 2 things came up consistently. The first was near constant interruptions and context switching that was a byproduct of growth. So people switching teams, filling gaps, new joiners asking lots of questions, and people who have been there a long time getting tapped on the shoulder. And then the second thing was they couldn't find stuff, and they had no idea who to talk to find stuff. Now, Spotify has a somewhat famous, agile, autonomous engineering culture. So we'd already done a ton of work in 2016 to break down software monoliths into microservices, and our platform engineering team had done a ton of work in bringing tools that our developers would really want to use into production. But these tools, however, were completely scattered across a multitude of microsites, and nobody knew where to find anything, and it was leading to this exact problem I've outlined of a lot of internal fragmentation and chaos. People were making things not knowing that they already existed. People were spending a lot less time writing code, and people weren't able to onboard quickly. So we knew that we needed a centralized solution for this problem, but we also knew that a top-down centralized mandate would be antithetical to our culture. So we also knew that we wanted to know more about these components and services than simply where they were running. We wanted to know, is the documentation up to date, and where is it? We wanted to know, is it running in production? We wanted to know who owned it and who to talk to if things went down. So in essence, we needed a centralized repository where everybody could find anything that they needed and nobody had to use anything. And so we built when we looked at what we had off the shelf, or what there was off the shelf at the time, there was nothing that would actually work at our size, and so we had to build it ourselves. We had to make it sticky and user-friendly, and it had to be something that could scale with our already staggering code base. So we built Backstage, what you now know as Backstage, and that changed absolutely everything. It aligned hundreds of squads, or what we call our cross-functional product development teams. It aligned thousands of engineers and tens of thousands of software components. And that time to 10th PR metric that I mentioned, it went from 60 days to 10 days. So Backstage is now a tier 1 mission-critical product at Spotify. Developers use it every day, and it cannot go down. So there's a lot of features to Backstage, but I'll just break down the 3 main jobs to be done. Backstage essentially lets any developer create software in seconds, aligned to your best practices through software templates and Scaffolder. It allows you to manage all the software you own in one centralized location with metadata and documentation baked in. And it allows you to explore and allows developers to explore and discover their entire software ecosystem through extensible and effective search. So if we look at this at a company level, what Backstage unlocks for an organization is the ability to grow and scale even as your developer population is likely to explode. And we're seeing that. The global developer population is set to be 100 million devs by 2025. If you're not already experiencing this growth, then I'm sure that you will. So Backstage allows you to manage the complexity of this growing ecosystem and people. It allows for faster onboarding. It allows for your teams to grow, but that not leading to you slowing down. So I think what makes Backstage most powerful is its extensible, customizable plugin architecture. So plugins are essentially any additional functionality that you need to make your Backstage app useful. And plugins can come from anywhere. They can be bespoke and unique to your organization, or they can be open sourced and reusable. So if you remember that autonomous engineering culture I mentioned that Spotify had, what that means is that each squad is able to operate on its own and make the best decisions about the tech and the architecture they're going to use. So what the plugin architecture with Backstage allowed was for everybody to build it themselves, to build it together, so that we had teams who were contributing solutions to common problems, and those things could then be contributed to Backstage as a plugin and used by other teams. It's essentially a marketplace of inner source contribution. And we're seeing this play out across the open source version as well. So at this stage, there are over 60 open source plugins within our open source plugin marketplace for Backstage, and that includes the core components like software catalog, software templates, and tech docs. And so that's all to say that the open source version is now, we're seeing vendors like PagerDuty, Snyk, Fire Hydrant contributing their first-party apps into the plugin ecosystem, and external adopters, who I'll get into in a little bit in terms of who they are contributing plugins that they've developed internally and believe will be useful to the rest of the external community. So you might be thinking, okay, why open source? Well, I think that the key thing to remember is, like, yes, while you're taking on another open source tool, like, this is when we first started to think about open sourcing Backstage, it was in part because people kept asking us about it. Spotify engineers would demo something, and then people would ignore the demo and be like, what's that? And they would be looking at the Backstage UI and pointing to it and saying, we're interested in what that thing is that you're showing us. So we realized that we had something special on our hands, given how effective Backstage was proving to be in terms of improving our developer productivity metrics. And we wanted to share that because we believed that it would be something that other people could benefit from. But selfishly, we also deeply believed that the best way to ensure Backstage's future at Spotify was to open source it. Meaning that in order to ensure we could continue to rely on it, we wanted it to be something that could keep a pace of change and innovation faster than it could internally at Spotify. And that's what we've seen in the open source community. So it's been pretty invaluable to get use cases and viewpoints from the world's largest airline, the world's fastest growing finance startup. We've seen third-party software vendors and individual contributors make the open source platform more robust, more sustainable, and keep the pace of change that's faster than anything anybody could do inside of their own company. And the proof is in the pudding. We absolutely love these numbers. I, as a marketer, absolutely love these numbers. I mean, what we're seeing with this growth of the open source platform since March 2020 is really that this is not a unique problem to Spotify, and that there are other people who can benefit from developer portals and from a product like Backstage. And in addition to that, I think the thing to really to bear in mind here is that these 250 adopting companies are only the ones that are publicly listed. We believe we have upwards of, almost 500 adopters at this point, and that's what's really, really exciting for us, is continuing to see more innovation and more contribution from these adopters. And what's, I think, again, really exciting is that some of these logos is where we're building this proven track record across industry. So really mature adopters like Netflix, American Airlines, and Expedia, they are now at the point within their adoption where they're starting to be able to measure proof of value and see where Backstage is helping move their developer effectiveness. And should you choose to adopt Backstage for your organization, we would really love if you made sure you were publicly listed on the GitHub repo. Just a little plug. So on the Spotify side, we're really working hard to partner with companies that are going to help extend Backstage and get it to be the industry standard out there in the world. So in addition to our partnership with VMware, with Backstage as the front-end GUI for TAP, we're also working with software consultancies like ThoughtWorks and Frontside, and those folks have done proven implementations of Backstage at this point for companies from small startups to Fortune 100s. What I think is the most exciting is we're seeing whole companies born out of the Backstage ecosystem, like Roadie, which is a hosted and managed service on top of Backstage that didn't exist 2.5 years ago. So thus endeth my Backstage overview. I hope that it was useful for everybody, and I'm looking forward to talking more about it with Alex. I'm just going to pause, let everybody navigate to this QR code for some helpful links. We've also built an onboarding tutorial experience on backstage.spotify.com/learn. Thanks very much, and I appreciate your time.
Well, Jen, so I walked into the keynotes yesterday and had some briefings beforehand, and Backstage kept coming up in conversation. And then...
That's music to my ears.
Yeah, I bet it is. And no pun intended.
Exactly.
No. Do you have any playlists that you'd recommend?
I mean, Rap Caviar is probably the most famous
Okay.
of the Hume algorithm.
Okay.
That's like our editorial team plus the algorithm doing its job.
Nice.
Butter is also very nice.
Butter,
I love
okay.
that one. Yeah, I mean, I build my own playlists pretty maniacally. So,
Oh, do you?
Yeah, I can.
How many do you have?
Oh my gosh, I have probably at least like 150 playlists.
Wow.
Yeah.
Do you organize them by like classical or hip hop or genre?
Absolutely. Well, I do one semi-periodic. I used to do it like weekly for my team because I was very good.
Oh,
at
you
writing
were?
Playlist.
Okay.
And now I do it less frequently.
Oh gosh, I'm gonna have to talk with you later about some playlists that you'd recommend. But butter and wrapped caviar, I like that. So anyway, so it kept coming up. The conversation it kept coming up in conversation, and I'm like, backstage. All I'm hearing is backstage. But I've heard a lot about Backstage before, and you know the new stack we've written about Backstage, and we've written about Spotify's open source efforts. What do you see is reflective in VMware that they're talking about it so much? I mean, obviously you just detailed a lot of the reasons why, but how does it serve as a solution? Because you just brought up VMware with different solutions providers that are helping enable people's use of building developer experiences.
Yeah, well, I'd really categorize VMware as like the forefront provider in terms of like pushing this. I mean, the tagline of this conference is the center of the multi-cloud universe, right?
Right.
And that's like VMware's sweet spot. And what they're doing with TAP and with the Tanzu application platform is they've built, not only is VMware an adopter of Backstage, so they've built their own developer portal that their teams utilize, you know, the 10,000 plus developers at VMware utilize, which is great. But they also made it the front end of TAP, so you can't use TAP without using Backstage, and that's like extremely exciting for us. You know, we have this very big ambition to see more Spotify-built software in all kinds of companies, big and small, and VMware is a really critical partner for us to do that.
So for those who may not be familiar, what does TAP stand for?
I believe it stands for the Tanzu
Application Platform.
Application Platform. There we go.
I was asking
I'm like,
you
am I using the acronym incorrectly?
I was asking you because I was trying to figure it out myself. Kind of an old reporter trick. Yeah, okay, so they have built their own platform to manage their own developer teams.
As I understand it, TAP is sort of, or Tanzu is more, is like the new PaaS. It's the new platform as a service.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of badass because I feel like PaaS got a bad rap in the mid to late aughts.
Bad rap.
A bad rap. Because people wanted control and they wanted VMs. And I don't think that they want that anymore.
Yeah, and people want to be more hip.
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah, because like that helps you like be more modern. That helps you be more flexible to some degree.
Yeah, I mean, I think like microservices and Kubernetes have won the day. We've seen that over the past decade.
You think so?
I believe so.
Okay.
I feel like that's probably the most obvious thing to say in 2022.
Okay, yeah, I think it's fair. So, what are the use cases you see from like other companies? And there must be companies that are in all kinds of sectors of the market that are using it now, considering the usage that you're seeing from it. What are some of the use cases you're seeing that are interesting to you?
The use cases that we're seeing that are, you know, so it's like we often tell people don't start with the software catalog because ingesting all of your software and building it into this centrally managed repository is a lot of work, particularly if you have, like us, like tens of thousands of software components, and like getting all that is a big bite of the elephant, if you will. So we often counsel external adopters to start narrow, and what we often see, and I think this is going to segue into something you and I talked about before, is our documentation's a mess. And we don't know where it is, and there's like 80 different microsites, and that's kind of one of the places we started with as well. So, you know, we often are like, hey, you know, start with tech docs and start with figuring out how you can like encourage, you know, this kind of virtuous cycle of folks writing their documentation in Markdown directly alongside this docs-like code solution that we built. Start by cleaning up your documentation. Start by determining whether or not you want to set up some, you know, with software templates and scaffolder, like what are your sort of, we call them at Spotify the golden paths. So these like architectural patterns that we believe are kind of the best ways to do things. And can you kind of like really start to bring and standardize in a way that is not like sort of mandating, but more encouraging folks to build in the patterns that you want them to build in.
So let's review once again the 3 major themes for Backstage.
Create, manage, explore.
So tell me, okay, create first.
Create first. Create first is really, again, alluding to software templates and scaffolder,
Right.
which is about being able to like create new software quite easily.
Right.
That's aligned to best practices. So
Okay.
that's that standardization piece. You know,
Okay.
like, and that all of that software, whatever you've created, you can manage in this one centralized repository, which is the software catalog. And that's oftentimes what people think of as sort of the sort of like backbone of a developer portal, or like of this kind of single unified UI, is the ability to see where all services and components are running, regardless of how and where they're running, and then getting to see, you know, the metadata attached to that, and who owns it, and the documentation right alongside it within the software catalog. So that's kind of like, that's the repo, if you will, like the centralized repository of software.
Okay,
And
manage.
then on the Explore side,
Explore, right.
that's about, and we have sort of a search platform that's a bit of BYO search engine, and it allows folks to ensure that there's really, really effective search, so that when people are like within their dev portal built off of Backstage, when developers are trying to find stuff, they can easily find it. Like the search entities will come up that for the right stuff. They'll be brought towards the right material that will then give them the information they need based on the other two.
Did you build your own search, or did you go to like an open source project for that?
Search is such an interesting one, because that was one where we definitely had an internal version, but versus like kind of externalizing that version in a way, we went to the community and said, what do you need? And then we built it alongside the contributor community. So
Elastic then? Or-
yeah, and there's Elastic, there's Postgres, there's everything that you
Okay.
could need. Like, it's really like, which one do you want?
Okay. Okay. And tell me, I'm curious about the documentation focus you put on it. What was the internal discussions about that? Like, why did you were saying that there were documentation matters you were trying to resolve internally at the time.
Yes.
That must have been part of it. What were some of the
Yes.
matters you were trying to resolve?
I definitely wasn't there, but I think the biggest thing is a little bit more of what I described, was that the documentation was kind of a mess. It wasn't up to date. There was really there's no mandate to keep it up to date, and it was sort of scattered over a multitude of different sites. So if something did have documentation, which was a big if, then you weren't able to find it, or the documentation would be outdated very quickly. And that is where the Docs Like Code solution of TechDocs came from. And it's deployed directly out of Backstage, so it lives inside of Backstage.
So it lived inside of Backstage.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So it was easily accessible.
Very easily accessible, and something that people could really easily look up the documentation, know that it was up to date, and it was right alongside the code.
There was a conversation on Twitter the other day about trying to find documents in a very popular platform. Starts with a G, second word D, starts with a D.
Oh, okay.
Anyway, it was Google Docs. I don't need to be.
Yeah. I'm like, alrighty.
But
I was at Google Cloud for 7 years.
yeah. So what they did was, they said, people were saying it's difficult to find docs sometimes.
Yeah.
You have a lot of docs in Google Docs.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people, like myself included, rely on recent. So these are the kind of developer experience issues you must have to think about all the time.
Constantly.
Like, so how did you resolve these kinds of issues? How did you start thinking about them? I mean, what is the community like internally at Spotify to that enables that kind of discussion and get to the place where you are?
Well, I don't think we're done yet by any means. There's so much more that we can do with Backstage internally, and it is where we are now bringing a lot of that external innovation from the community. Like, the core maintainers of the open source project are managing roughly 100 pull requests per week, and 80% of those are coming from non-maintainer contributors. So it's safe to say the innovation within the open source project is coming from the external community, and now we're pulling that in. But I think the other thing is about how much focus you put on it. I mean, we have an entire we call them tribes at Spotify, but an entire group called Platform Developer Experience. That is their sole remit and mission, is how are we improving developer experience for all of the devs within R&D at Spotify. And I know that those positions and functions exist in other companies, whether that be platform engineering or whether or not they do have dedicated DX teams, but I think that is really the key, is like, do you have sort of the headcount and focus? Because I will say that like creating your own developer portal, even based off of an open source platform like Backstage, is not easy work. There's a lot to do.
Yeah, it's not easy work. There's a lot to do, and you bring up platform engineering, and I've been actually kind of writing a story about platform engineering based on the discussions I'm having here. And it's interesting because you can look at platform engineering in a few different ways. You can look at it from like top down,
Sure.
or you can look at it for like, for instance, application engineering manager
Mm-hmm.
up.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also the point of view that it's also about process and governance as much as anything. So, so is it top down at Spotify?
No.
Is it bottom up?
I think that's the thing, is like something like Backstage wouldn't have come into existence were it not for the fact that like top down doesn't happen at Spotify. It is all about bottom up. It is all about incentivizing. It is all about creating the virtuous cycles that allow people to do their jobs effectively, but also do the right thing. And that is, I think, what's so special about it, and why we believe, particularly as a cultural change agent, we feel like that's what's really cool about Backstage, is the plugin architecture, which allows for this marketplace of inner source contribution within your company. So the company that owns, within our instance of Backstage, there's only about 4 to 6 engineers who manage the core deployment internally. And then there's over 200 plugins that have been contributed by over 100 squads, and that based on like them owning the domain or area of expertise. So the plugin that shows you the status of current builds is owned by the team that owns build systems.
So the process and workflows are up to the teams individually then?
Basically, the plugins allow for people to contribute a use case to a common problem, and then other teams can pick it up rather than having to reinvent the wheel. So it kind of is these plugins that sit on top of they can really be anything. Like they can be, seeing the current status of data pipelines owned by the data team. We have a learning and development team, our tech learning team, that has built this incredible plugin called Skill Exchange, which is essentially a marketplace of learning and development stuff. So it's basically like your mini LinkedIn, but you also can explore like embeds, which are short-term opportunities on other teams, hacks. You can find hacks, start hacks, and pairing and mentoring, in addition to like coursework or things that you want to like skill develop and level up in. And that's a plugin embedded into Backstage. So it's really like, what do you want your dev portal to be? How do you want it to be shaped? Like, is it this kind of centralized software catalog at the most basic level, like that shows you all your services, or is it going to be this thing that moves your developer culture forward in a bottoms-up way, in a inner source contribution way?
Then what about the pipeline though? Like what about like that? What about an automated pipeline that is kind of important to have in a tool chain, isn't it?
Sure. Yeah, and we have those. I mean, you're getting my technical expertise this is where it's going to go.
Yeah.
But I think that we obviously have like a lot of automation built in and baked in, but you still get to decide like what your database is going to be. And in some, we are a Google Cloud customer, absolutely, but we also have acquisitions that are using other clouds. And so we have a lot of different and if you want to be using open source technology within whatever it is that you're creating, then that's available to you too.
So where do you go from here? Like you're now part of the Cloud Native Computing Foundation's incubation project. Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
And so where do you go from here? Like what are the next steps for what you all want to do with Backstage?
Yeah, so we've talked about this. We shared this with the community last year, so it's definitely not a spoiler. But at the Spotify level, I mean, our goal is sort of twofold. One is to like get Backstage or get developer portals built off of Backstage into as many companies as possible, like make it the de facto standard. And we want that in part because we want to continue to see this open source community grow and create this more sustainable platform that everybody can kind of leverage common integrations and build things that work for them and in the shape and style of what they need. And then the other is that at Spotify, we're also developing commercial plugins because, as I mentioned, like we have 200 plus plugins internally at Spotify that we've built over the 5 years since we developed Backstage. And we think that some of those are going to be very useful to Backstage adopters. So we're going to be offering those on a paid license basis to Backstage adopters to plug into their Backstage.
So it's a kind of extension of your business model, isn't it?
It is a little bit, yeah.
Wow. Wow. And so you'll continue to open source projects then too, because I know you have a OSPO now as well.
We do, and us offering kind of paid plugins is not moving away from, it's actually moving away from the open source project. It's actually a way for us to sustain our investment in the open source project.
Yeah. Well, Jen, thank you so much. I feel so enlightened by this. I'm not sure of the song that I would think of that would kind of like express my enlightenment. But maybe is there a song about reflection that you can think about?
Oh man, literally the only thing that popped into my head because I have a 3-year-old is Reflection from Mulan.
Okay.
I'm not gonna sing it. Christina Aguilera did it better.
Yeah, she did it better. I won't sing it either. Okay, thanks so much, Jen.
Thank you.
Okay.